All right, well, we're going to get started. This session is called ArcGIS Runtime Styling Maps. My name is Lucas Danziger, and I'm here with Michael Wilburn. We're both engineers on the ArcGIS Runtime SDK team. And this is a cross SDK session that we're doing. We're doing several general runtime sessions that dive deep into a functional area. And that's because we have the same designs throughout the runtime. So we're not doing a specific, iOS, .NET, Java session on styling maps. We're just doing one generic one. So you might see some code in a specific language here. The concepts still apply, so don't feel like it's not going to be applicable to you. So what are we going to cover in this session? It's not a cartography session. We're not really cartographers, sad to say. But we know a little bit about how to design and style maps with the different platform tools that we have and the APIs that we have. So yeah, we're going to focus less on cartography and more how to work with your layers, symbols, renderers, and the different authoring tools that we have. So when you think about how to style your maps, there's lots of different things that you should consider. What type of app are you building? What information are you trying to show? Who's your target audience? And as you see, there's so many things going on here that it sort of gets hard to know what do I use when. So we've broken it up into 3 common use cases that we hear. And so we're going to go through each of those, and we're hoping that everybody can sort of identify with one more than the other. If you find yourself sort of in the middle, we can take concepts from each and use some of the tools from each. So the first one we're calling the simple location-based app. So this is for people that just want to build an app with a map in it, have some graphics on it, base maps, nothing too crazy. They typically want to render this on phones and all different devices. Maybe a local government is making a 311 app that they want their citizens to download, run it on their phones. The second is what we're calling the heavy GIS user app. And this is really for people that need a little bit more, less of like the generic map, but really getting in more into GIS. So they have maybe very complex symbols. You might be in the utility space or public safety, defense, intelligence, those types of things. You also might need to work offline. You can't really just depend on online services. And the last we're calling the system integrator enterprise apps. And these are for people that have large scale apps, do lots of different things, and they have existing workflows and data feeds and all of these different custom workflows that they do. And they need to bring maps into their application. And they might actually have access to the rest of the platform. They need to do everything in code. So that's kind of the last target group that we're talking about. So when you consider styling maps for runtime, there's really 3 different authoring tools that you have. First being ArcGIS Online, second being Pro, and third Runtime. If you're using online, you can take advantage of our different smart mapping tools. They help you make good decisions that are good cartographic decisions so that you can convey your data in your map correctly. They allow you to create web maps where you can share those throughout the platform. Pretty much everywhere in the platform we work with web maps, so online is a good option for that. We also have lots of data that's available already in ArcGIS Online for you to take advantage of. We also have Pro, and Pro is a much more powerful cartographic application. It also has lots of different analysis tools for you. Once you design your maps in Pro, you can then share them as web maps, you can share them as services, or you can actually package up mobile map packages and use those offline in runtime. And finally, if you want, you can just build everything up in code in runtime. So that's kind of the third option. You could also take an existing map from online or Pro and then modify it in runtime. So remember we talked about the 3 different patterns. We're gonna dive into a demo right away of the very first one that we talked about, the simple location-based app.
Okay, well thanks Luke. Everyone able to hear me all right? Great. So as Luke mentioned, the first persona is being able to style and author a map that's very simple. And for this context, we're actually going to be using ArcGIS Online. So this is done entirely through the browser. Many of you are probably familiar with this approach, but we're going to step through it anyways. This does not require me having any of the data locally on my machine. In fact, what I've done is already tracked down a service which I'd like to use and which I'd like to display on my map. So I've copied that feature service URL, and I can go to the add layer here, and I want to just specify that URL. You'll see that it gets added to my map, and because there's a lot of data in this particular feature service, I want to probably pare it down to something a little bit more finite, something a little bit easier to deal with. I happen to be from the state of Oregon, so I'm a little bit biased, so let's take a look at some of the data for that state. I can specify a definition query, and by applying that filter and then zooming to that area, we're now looking at the zip codes for just the state of Oregon. Now, one of the cool things about ArcGIS Online is that it takes advantage and it allows you to basically do this concept of smart mapping, where depending on the data that you're attempting to display and the data types or the field types of the attributes that you're symbolizing, it'll offer you these dynamic suggestions of ways to show that data. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Right now we're visualizing all of our different zip codes just by location, so they're colored the same. But let's say, for example, that we wanted to view the ratio of median household income to median home value. So you'll notice that as soon as I specified those two fields, under this number 2 select a drawing style wizard sort of interface here, I get a number of different options. And by default, it's given me symbology where the gradient or the color of each circle is telling us the household income, whereas the size of that circle is deliberately conveying that median home value. I think a little bit more of an intuitive way to view this is as a simple comparison. So now I can see, based on just a singular gradient, the way that those polygon fields are being shaded, I can see what that ratio is. And to make this stand out a little bit better, I'd like to include a different base map. You can see over on the right-hand side of my screen, I'm signed in as myself, and my organization is configured such that the Select a Base Map dropdown is configured only to show vector tile base maps. The reason for this is, particularly in the runtime, runtime apps often get consumed on high mobile devices with a very high DPI display. And these vector tiles are particularly good at showing up no matter the view scale. There's not an issue that you often may see where things look a little bit pixelated or a little bit more fuzzy with raster tiles. Vector tiles are very responsive, and they're also very, very sharp. So we're going to use a vector tile base map as a backdrop here. And because I've chosen the dark gray, we can see that there's a nice amount of contrast. So I'll click Done to commit to that symbology. And what I want to do next is I want to save this map to my organization. We'll call this just a simple web map. And we'll give it a tag of Dev Summit. And we'll save that. Now it's going to save it to my organizational content. And I also want to make sure to share this so that I can consume it myself. And we'll just share it publicly. And you may or may not have noticed that the URL here changed when I actually committed to saving that web map. What I want to do next is take this item ID, we'll copy it, I'm going to jump over into my IDE, and I've got a snippet of code where we can essentially take an item ID, from that create a web map item, and we're dealing with that portal item, and we want to stick it inside of a map and then place that in a map view. So by respecifying a new item ID, I can paste in the one that we just copied. I'll go ahead and save my changes, and then we can run my app and we can see what this looks like in a desktop framework, consuming that web map that we just created. And there you go.
All right, so that was the simple location-based app. Just to do a little bit of a recap, Mike, in this scenario, needed to build an app or a map that was accessible to everybody, so he used ArcGIS Online because the web map is something that can be used throughout the platform. He also used the smart mapping tools, and these helped him pick the symbols and renders to use, and it made a very nice and interesting map and story behind what he was building. He chose to use vector tile layers because vector tile layers scale well, and he had a requirement to have it work well on a phone. Just to dive into that a little bit, when we say vector tile layers, we're comparing it to raster tile layers, which are what we have used in the past. We still continue to use. Raster tile layers are basically directories full of images that reflect rows and columns and levels of detail. So as you pan and zoom throughout a map, it's just sending a bunch of images. So the nice thing about that is that it's very simple to do. It's very low on the network bandwidth to use. But when you have a high DPI device that you want to use, let's say it's a 300 DPI device and your images were cooked at 256 by 256 at 96 DPI, they're not going to look very good. So they're going to have to be stretched and not look too good. So he used vector tile layers because it's just vectors on the back end that can scale to really any DPI device. And last but not least, it's a very simple authoring and coding experience. He had a nice UI and UX to do that in ArcGIS Online. And the coding experience is basically just create a map, instantiate a map from a web map ID. In the future, if you want to update the map, you don't have to recompile and re-release your app. You just update the map. Your code references the ID, and it's all good to go. So now we're going to jump into the second group, the heavy GIS user. And as you'll recall, this is the type of group that typically falls more into the utilities or public safety or command and control centers, defense, those types of more traditional GIS markets that we think of. So we'll jump back to Mike then to give that demo.
Okay, so this time I'm actually working inside of ArcGIS Pro. This is one of Esri's desktop mapping platforms. So we'll put myself in the shoes of a GIS user who's really well acquainted with being able to use the desktop tooling. And using this type of experience working inside of ArcGIS Pro, I have many more options in terms of symbology and the way in which I can go about authoring a map. For this particular demonstration, we're going to create a mobile map package, and I'll show you some of the considerations that we take when authoring the symbols that get consolidated into the mobile map package. So in this particular case, we're looking at an area of Naperville, Illinois, where I have some utility networks displayed on the ground. And I'm looking at a couple of different resources. So I've got water system valves and also water system mains. Now it's very common in the utility network world to represent particular resources with very distinct symbology. So you'll notice over here on the right, I've got different valve types reflected with these, what we refer to as advanced symbols. And Luke's going to go into a little bit more detail about this as well. But whereas on ArcGIS Online, I've got these very simple symbols, ArcGIS Pro and the Runtime support the ability to author and read advanced symbols. And what I mean by that is that if I click in on any one of these point symbols, I can see that it's usually comprised of multiple layers. And I can click through and see that there are these very distinct rules where I have multiple layers of shape marker symbols to represent my point information and indeed the different valves that I have displayed here. Now this is necessary because it's a little bit more specific than just using a general unique value renderer. The other thing that I'm representing on my map are water mains. And I'll disable the water system valves for just a minute just to make these a little bit more clear. And what we're doing is we're reflecting the diameter of each of these water main pipes so that we can see, based on the thickness of the line, what the relative diameter of that pipe is. And there's something also unique that's going on here. You can see that there are these directional arrows which are indicating the direction of the water flow within the pipe. And this is something, if I'm a field worker and I want to be able to go work offline, which is what mobile map package is really designed to be able to do, a read-only context using it in an offline scenario. I may want to be aware when conducting an inspection or evaluating the condition of a pipe or a water main where the water flow is coming from and where it's headed. So if we highlight one of these, we can see that part of that advanced symbol is indeed another directional arrow that I've placed here. So two different types of advanced symbologies that we're working with here. And I want to be able to consolidate, package this up into what is referred to as a mobile map package. This has a .mmpk file extension, and it's something that can be authored only in Pro and is specifically there so that it can be consumed inside of a runtime app. Now I do have an alternate workflow where I could just as easily publish this as a feature service hosted on portal or organization, and I can consume it that way. I won't be talking too much about that, but just know that it is an option with the runtime. What we want to do instead is go ahead and author or create a mobile map package. Now, this particular geoprocessing tool, which is designed for the purpose of creating mobile map package, does support multiple input maps. For the purpose of this scenario, we're only going to include the one that we've created just now, this emergency response map. You can see that it's indicated by default. We'll pick an output file location to create this, and let's just nicely call this advanced symbols _2. We'll save it to the same location on the desktop. I'm going to go ahead and copy this path because we're going to consume this in our runtime app right after this. You can see that I also have the ability with this geoprocessing tool to include a locator. So within my runtime app, if I want to be able to support feature search or address point search, that could be included as well. Of course, some metadata. I'm going to go ahead and click and allow this tool to run. So what's going on right now is it's taking all of my disparate data and the map information, including the symbology, and it's consolidating it into one file. And that's that MMPK file that's going to be created here. The nice thing about mobile map packages is that it contains not only the data, but the map itself. So that symbology persists with this mobile map package. And we're going to read it into the runtime with all of that included. You can see that it completed. So we're going to step back over to Qt Creator. And I've got a snippet of code here which allows me to instantiate a mobile map package. And I'll specify my new path for where this lives. It should only be 2 new characters. And we're going to go ahead and load that mobile map package. And this specific line is important too. This allows us to load a particular map within the mobile map package. And because there's only one map, then we want to make sure to specify that first one. It's an index-based 0. So we'll save these changes. And we'll go ahead and allow this to run. And here we go. We got my runtime app that includes that same symbology that we just authored right here on the desktop.
Okay, so that was the Heavy GIS user group that works more with advanced complex symbols. So in this scenario, Mike had to work offline, so he decided to create a mobile map package. The key thing to take out of here is that advanced symbol work that he was doing. We'll talk about that more in the next slide here. And he had his own organizational data. In this case, it was a vector tile package. So the vector tile package got packaged up with the mobile map package, and then he was able to deploy that in the runtime application. You'll notice the code is very similar as well for creating the mobile map package and obtaining the map. It's a very simple coding experience as far as how to obtain the map and data that you've created in Pro. So like I said, the key thing in that demo is this concept of advanced symbols. And when we talk about advanced symbols, we're talking about multi-layer symbols. In the first demo, even though they're very nice looking symbols, they're very simple when you think about it. It was circles that got bigger and smaller, and they changed colors. Very effective for some use cases, but for some scenarios, you need to do a lot more than that. So for simple symbols, think about with points, for example, you can change the style. So you can have a circle, a triangle, a square, or you can even take an image and display that as a point. With lines, you can do things like make it either a solid or a dashed line. And for polygons, you can have either a completely solid fill, or you can make it a picture fill where it's a repeated image over and over again inside of the polygon. And with each of those, you can change color. But beyond that, that's about all you can do with simple symbols. Again, it serves its use case, but if you need to do more than that, you hit the limitation, and you start to need to consider using multi-layer advanced symbols, which are what the Pro symbols are. In this case, Mike created the mobile map package, but you could also publish a feature service, or you can construct a mobile style file in Pro as well and share those advanced symbols with runtime through that mechanism. Think about the UI that he showed where it had the multiple symbol layers. That's really the key thing to understand. So you can have a red line and then a marker that's at a directional arrow. That's the concept that we're going with here is multi-layer symbols. So where can you consume these different symbols everywhere in the platform you can consume simple symbols. So ArcGIS Online, Pro, Runtime. If you have simple symbols, you can consume those anywhere. Advanced symbols can be consumed in Pro and Runtime, currently not supported in Online. Where do you author these? At the moment, you can publish simple symbols with any part of our platform, Online, Pro, Runtime. But for advanced symbols, you have to create them in Pro right now. There's one caveat. In Runtime, we're currently working on an API to programmatically create multi-layer symbols just in code, which is pretty cool. At that point, you could bypass the Pro workflow that Mike just used and just write it up in code. But for the time being, you have to author mobile map packages, feature services, or style files in Pro and consume those in Runtime. And now we'll jump into the final persona, which is the system integrator custom enterprise app.
Okay, so in this scenario, I'm going to be in the shoes of a user who is primarily a developer, very well potentially acquainted with the ArcGIS Runtime SDKs, but maybe not so much with the rest of the ArcGIS platform, or someone who doesn't have access to the rest of the ArcGIS platform. So insofar as authoring a map in the same way that I showcased in the first two demos, this is a little bit more of a programmatic approach for doing that. So what we're looking at here is what I'll call a custom data feed. It's essentially some JSON depicting some points that are reflected with a little bit of a name attribute as well as an X and Y on location that's indicating the lat and long. And what I want to do, although this is a very simple example, we're only looking at 3 different elements, you can imagine that this is potentially very, very long. And it can be formatted, and as long as you know what that format is and you can recognize it and parse through it, it's something that the runtime can understand, and you can take each one of these elements and represent them on the map. So that's what we're going to do here. So I've got my custom data feed, that JSON, and what I want to do is I want to take that text file, recognize it as a JSON object, and then go through each one of those elements in that feed, creating a graphic from that element, recognizing it as a point, setting the attribute of that point, and then adding that point to the graphics overlay. So that's the first half of this approach. The second half involves actually setting or creating my renderer, how I'm going to depict each one of these elements in my feed. And what we've chosen here is to create a unique value symbol for each of the different elements. So wherever that point has a name attribute equal to California, we're going to render it with a red X of size 24, right? And wherever I've got a point with the name of Minnesota, we're going to render it with a green square of that same size. And then anywhere that I don't have an element that matches either one of those criterias, then I'm going to render it with just a simple default symbol. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute when we launch this app. So then I pass that into my unique value renderer, and we'll see what that looks like on the map. We'll go ahead and run this application. And we can see that here in North America, with the approximate locations of Minnesota, South Dakota, I think is what we chose, and Southern California, we can see our 3 different symbols, and that's that default symbology here. So although this is a very, very simple scenario with a pretty straightforward feed, you can see that you can very easily parse through that feed, set up a unique value renderer, and essentially plot these points on a map.
Okay, so just to summarize, that was the system integrator enterprise app workflow. So in this case, a very simple app, but you can imagine an already existing app that had the different processes and workflows. Maybe you have some UDP port opened up and you have data streaming in, coming in some custom proprietary format. And you read those in, display them as graphics, create symbols and renders in code. In this case, you use an Esri provided base map just in code. But you'll notice the coding experience is a little bit more advanced. In the previous demos, all he had to do was reference the map that he authored elsewhere, and that was about it. But now, because he's building it all up, he has to define all of the graphics, he has to define the symbols and the renders, and manage that all himself, which potentially is beneficial, but it also is more work up front. It's important to note here that those were simple symbols. because at the moment you can only publish simple symbols from Runtime. So in the future, he could make more advanced symbols like we saw in the Pro demo in code, but currently it's just the simple symbols. So what should you take away from this demo? I think the first thing to know is that there's many different options for use, so different tools and workflows and data types. And so it can be a little confusing to know where to start, but I think it will help if you consider the 3 different groups that we talked about and think about where you fall within it. You know, are you more of the simple location-based app, or more of the heavy GIS type of app, or the system integrator type of app? We suggest, if you can, to use the existing tools, ArcGIS Online and Pro. If you don't need to reinvent something, don't do it. They have nice user interfaces and user experiences to build and style these maps, and there's oftentimes a bit more robust support for the different options than what you get in the API. So oftentimes it's advantageous to use those tools. But we understand that sometimes you don't have that option and you need to build it up in Runtime, sorry. And in that case, there are some advantages. You don't have dependency on any other tools. It's potentially more flexible because you can fit it into your existing workflows. So that's still something we definitely support and we understand people need to do. So with that, please take our survey. It's on the Esri Events app. We'd like to hear your feedback of anything we can do differently or things that you enjoyed. And we don't really have very much time for questions, maybe one, and then we'll take questions in the back so we can let the next group get set up. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending.